Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. Today's episode is very special because this is episode 60. It is mind-boggling to me that I've released 60 episodes of me rambling on and on about Pirates of the Caribbean. But in this episode, we are finishing our 3-episode journey through the Swashbucklers side of the Pirates of the Caribbean universe. If you didn't listen to episodes 58 and 59, go listen to those so you're all caught up with everything we've covered so far. On episode 58, we talked about some children's books that are illustrated in the Swashbucklers art style, and on the last episode, we covered half of the Swashbucklers comics, specifically the ones that could be found in the Disney Adventures magazine. But today, we are continuing to cover the rest of the Swashbucklers comics, and we have 12 more to talk about today. Now, while the ones in the last episode were primarily found in the Disney Adventures magazine, the comics we're covering today could be found in the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine. Now, what is the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine, you may be asking, and why have I not heard of it before? Well, the reason many of you may not have heard of this before is because it was only printed overseas in multiple European countries. It was never actually printed in English to my knowledge, which is why a lot of you may have never heard of it. But if you're an international listener and you grew up in the 2000s, you might remember seeing this magazine or maybe even owning one of the issues yourself. There were 14 issues of this magazine in total, and it ran from June 2006 to June 2008. Now, I know you may be asking, what did these magazines contain? Well, they weren't what you would classify as a normal magazine. The Disney Adventures magazine was more like a traditional magazine, as it had news articles and advertisements, along with comics and games, which are all things you would potentially find in an actual magazine. The Pirates of the Caribbean magazine, though, was more like an activity book than a real magazine. These issues were geared towards kids and included different kinds of activities and games, along with descriptions of characters, ships, and locations from the movies. And of course, they also included comics, which are what we are focusing on today. Now, Pirates of the Caribbean is not the only franchise to have gotten this kind of magazine treatment, as these types of things are pretty popular with massive Disney franchises. Some current examples of this are the Disney Princess magazine, Frozen, the official magazine, and there's also some Marvel ones too, like the Avengers magazine and the Spider-Man magazine. These contain essentially the same kind of content that the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine did, so they have activities like coloring pages and games, along with short stories and comics. Now, information on these types of magazines is pretty limited, so I'm not sure if they are printed both overseas and here in the United States, but while looking for these, I found a huge collection of Frozen magazines on the Internet Archive, which all happen to be in English. So it seems all of these newer magazines are at least printed over here in the US. I know for sure the Frozen magazine is also printed overseas, but I digress. So if these other magazines were printed in the US, the question is, why weren't the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine issues printed over here as well? We unfortunately will probably never know the answer to that question. Now, given that this Pirates of the Caribbean magazine was not printed in the United States, it is essentially impossible to find any issues of it for sale anywhere. I have looked over and over again to no avail. But the reason we even have these comics to talk about today is due to the incredible effort of someone in the Pirates community, who I have actually mentioned on here before, way back on episodes 16 and 19, when we first started covering the earliest Pirates of the Caribbean comics. This person goes by the name Captain Bulbul, or 66 Sean 99 on their LiveJournal page, where they have archived so much Pirates of the Caribbean media. Given that their LiveJournal blog is in Russian, I would assume they are as well. And along with all the other Pirates media they have archived, they also scanned every single issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine. Unfortunately, a lot of the links and images on their LiveJournal blog are dead now, which I believe is due to the server that many of the images were hosted on going down. This also goes for the scans of the Pirates magazine, and for a while, I thought that these comics had all become lost media again, as Captain Bulbul was the only person I knew of who had actually scanned these issues. Thankfully, I found another Pirates community member on DeviantArt who goes by the name Noble Pirate, and they took all the comic scans from Captain Bulbul's LiveJournal page before they went down and uploaded Google translated versions of the comics on their DeviantArt page. I was glad the comics were at least no longer lost, but I decided since the translation was pretty iffy, I would perform the task of giving all of these comics a proper English translation, which meant going through each page of all of these comics and putting in English text in all of the speech bubbles throughout. It was a very long process, as 11 of the 12 comics we'll be talking about today had to be translated. One of them, The Sails of Doom, actually appeared in the Disney Adventures magazine as well, so I was able to buy that issue and scan that comic myself. But most of the comics in this magazine were of the longer variety, being 12 pages long. So this whole entire translation process took over 30 hours of work in total across multiple days, as each one of these comics was a 2 to 3 hour process to make them as good as they could possibly be. I ended up actually finding lower quality scans of the comics in Russian on Captain Bulbul's Tumblr blog, and along with the higher quality scans that Noble Pirate had uploaded with the Google translated text on their DeviantArt page, I went through each piece of text looking at the Google translated pages from Noble Pirate and at the original Russian pages from Captain Bulbul, and tried my best to have each piece of dialogue be as in character as possible, and also have everything understandable as well, as sometimes the translation ended up being a bunch of gibberish. So long story short, the comics I will be reading today are the same comics with the same art from the Pirates magazine, but the dialogue is not original. I do want to preface that. It is my own translation, and there were times where I had to take liberties on what some dialogue meant, as the translated version just did not make any sense. But I want you to know that I put so much effort into this translation, as I've wanted to cover these comics on this podcast for a very long time. I did my best to give each one of these comics as close to an official translation as possible, and not to brag or anything, but I think I did a pretty good job. Once again, I just want to give a massive shout out to Captain Bulbul and Noble Pirate, as without them, we would not be able to talk about these comics at all today. If either of you happen to be listening to this, thank you both for your incredible contributions to archiving and preserving Pirates media like this. I am eternally grateful to both of you. I hope to put these translated comics up online at some point when I get the chance, as I assume that there are many of you who have never even heard of or read these comics before. So stay tuned for that. I don't know what's going to happen, but hopefully in the near future. But with that super long-winded introduction out of the way, let's finally dive into the comics that you could find in the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine. So just like on the last episode, we'll be going in publication order essentially. First up is The Dark Skull, which appeared in the first issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in June 2006. You may also see this comic called either The Black Skull or The Gray Skull as well, but I believe the official name is The Dark Skull. This comic revolves around Jack Sparrow constructing a skull from its scattered pieces to locate the lost treasure of none other than Sir Francis Drake. So let's dive into it. So the narration in the comic begins, "The bayou by the Pantano River, some time ago." And then we go inside Tiadalma's shack, and we see Jack Sparrow meeting up with Tiadalma. And Tiadalma says, "Well, well, Jack Sparrow, as I live and breathe, what brings you here?" And Jack says, "I wouldn't know. Fate, lust for adventure, or maybe this. I took this from a Spanish officer out of Providence." And he drops a dark bone on her table. And Tiadalma says, "You know you must pay me. Tiadalma does not give answers for free." And Jack says, "I'll meet your price. Just tell me about this strange bone." And Tiadalma says, "This burned bone is a sign of betrayal. It is all that is left of Sam Johnson." And Jack says, "The first mate of Sir Francis Drake?" And Tiadalma says, "Yes, and you know Drake's treasure was never found." And Jack says, "Darling, I am all ears." And Tiadalma continues and says, "Find the rest of the skull, and then you will find the treasure, and I demand part of Johnson's skull as payment. One more thing, Jack. Among the treasure are 2 magic stones. The purple stone protects you from curses, and the white brings you fortune and eternal glory. Try not to use them." And Jack says, "Fortune and glory? Interesting. But tell me, where is the rest of the skull?" And then we go later aboard the Black Pearl, and we hear Gibbs say, "The last piece, Jack." And Jack says, "This skull smells strange." And Gibbs says, "Of course it does. We found it in the hold of a sunken galleon, but I don't smell it. I can't believe we're about to find Drake's treasure." And Gibbs puts in the last piece of the skull, and he says, "And here I thought skulls brought bad luck." And right after Gibbs puts the last piece on the skull, he turns to stone. And Jack yells out, "Gibbs! It was cursed. I'm sorry, Gibbs. I'll find a way to break this curse." And then we hear a new voice say, "Hey! Hey you, long hair! I'm getting pretty bored here." And Jack says, "What?" And we see the skull has come to life, and he continues, "Isn't this a pirate ship? Where is the crew? All hands to stations! Ready to the guns, you bilge rats! I haven't felt this alive in years!" And Jack interrupts and says, "Johnson, I don't suppose you've noticed you're just a skull, and I'm the captain here." And Sam says, "I'm sorry, Captain. What is your name?" And Jack says, "Jack Sparrow. Now tell me where Drake's treasure is." And Sam says, "And reveal this secret to such a cruel pirate? I saw how you cursed your first mate." And Jack said, "I didn't know about the curse." And Sam says, "All right, I'll tell you where the treasure is. But first, let's make a deal." And then the narration says, "And so, the next night." And we come up on an island in the distance, and Jack asks, "Is that it? Isla Cueva?" And Sam says, "Yes, the cave is on that island. Drake loved that rock, but I hate it. Don't forget our deal, Jack. You must reunite me with my body, which is buried under the treasure." And Jack says, "First, Sam, I must get what I came here for." And then we go a little later inside the cave. And Sam says, "Here's the entrance. Now do as I say. There are traps only I know of." And Jack says, "Take him, Cotton, and send him in first." And Sam says, "Tread carefully, Cotton. I am precious merchandise." And we hear Cotton's parrot says, "Rotten, rotten merchandise." And Sam says, "Hey, I don't see why I should go first." And Jack says, "Just in case you forget any traps." And we see Cotton trips on a tripwire, and Sam yells, "Get down!" And Cotton and Jack narrowly miss a bunch of spears that spring out of the wall. And Sam says, "Oops, I completely forgot that one." And Jack pulls out his sword and points it at Johnson's skull and says, "One more mistake, Sam Johnson, and you'll stay a skull forever." And then we hear a crew member call out, "Captain, come see." And then they walk around the edge of this cave, and they come into a large, open cave filled with treasure. And Sam says, "Untold riches." "Hey, Jack, time to keep your promise. My skeleton is down here." And Jack says, "I still don't have what I'm looking for." "Here." And he finds the 2 stones that Tiadama had mentioned earlier. And Sam says, "Oh, I see. But be careful. You can only take 1 stone, or else the cave will collapse." "Well then, can I have my body back now?" And Jack says, "All right, Cotton, do as he says." And Sam says, "Finally!" And Cotton puts the skull back on the rest of Sam Johnson's body. And we go back over to Jack, and he says, "Fortune and glory, sure, but there are more precious things." And he picks up the purple stone. And then we hear Cotton's parrot yell out, "Mutiny!" And then Jack turns around to see Sam Johnson charging at him with a sword drawn. And Jack yells, "Traitorous scoundrel!" And Sam says, "Stupid Sparrow, why do you think my bones are so dark? It's because I betrayed Drake. And now I'll kill you and take command of the Black Pearl." And Jack says, "Dark bones and a black ship? No one would even see you." And Jack knocks Sam down the hill of treasure, and Sam falls into a treasure chest, which closes on him, which essentially traps him in this chest. And Sam yells out, "Curse you!" And Jack walks over and picks off one of Sam's fingernails and says, "Sorry, but I need this to settle a debt." "Well, what are you waiting for? Grab everything you can carry." And Jack turns around to see Sam grabbing the last stone off the pedestal. And Jack yells out, "Hey!" And Sam says, "I don't think so. You'll join me for eternity, pirates." And then the cave begins to collapse, as Sam said earlier. And Marty says, "What's going on?" And Jack yells, "Drop everything and run! The cave is collapsing!" And Sam yells, "You'll never make it!" And everyone besides Sam Johnson is able to make it out alive. And Marty says, "We survived, but we lost all the gold." And we hear Cotton's parrot yell out, "Greedy!" And Jack, of course, still has the purple stone, and he says, "We've got something far more valuable." And then we have some more narration that says, after, Jack used the stone to free Gibbs from the curse. And Gibbs says, "What? You left all of Drake's treasure to save me?" And Jack says, "Sure, but in return I got you, a good friend. Isn't that a bargain?" And that is the end of The Dark Skull. This one is pretty cool, as it introduces a new character named Sam Johnson, who according to this comic was the first mate of Sir Francis Drake. Of course, in real life there was no person named Sam Johnson who was a first mate of Francis Drake, but I think it's cool that Drake is tied into this comic, as he is obviously a very infamous pirate, and definitely more well known now because of the Uncharted video games, which are great. I've mentioned Uncharted a few times on this podcast before, but seriously, go play them if you never have before. Anyway, Gibbs is turned to stone, and the only way to free him is to find one of 2 stones in the cave on Isla Cueva. Jack needs Sam Johnson's help to find it, and of course, Johnson turns on Jack at the end. Who could have seen that coming? But regardless, this comic is super fun, and I love how we also get an appearance from Tia Dalma at the beginning too. But let's move on to the Sails of Doom. This appeared in the 2nd issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in September 2006, and as I said earlier, also appeared in the Disney Adventures magazine Fall 2006 Comic Zone issue. In this story, Jack sees what he believes to be 2 ships approaching behind the Black Pearl, but we'll find out that not everything is as it appears. So let's read this one. So we start out with Gibbs, and he says, "Captain, it's good to have you back on board. How did you escape from Norrington's grasp?" And Jack says, "The same way I usually make my escape, mate. Except this time I used a large octopus instead of a coconut." And Gibbs scratches his head and says, "You can't be serious." And Jack says, "It's harder to handle the buggers, but once they're on a fellow's face they do an excellent job of sticking." And then we hear one of the Black Pearl crew from the rigging. He yells down to Jack, "Captain, 2 ships on our tail. They're gaining on us." And Jack says, "No need to get all huffy-puffy, mate. Probably nothing more than a pair of skiffs. Let me take a look." And the guy who had seen them first, he comes down and says, "Mighty big skiffs, Captain." And Jack says, "Mr. Gibbs, chart a course out of here. No ship can outsail the Pearl." And then they magically both disappear, and Gibbs says, "Seems there no need, Captain. The ships have vanished." And Jack says, "What are these things?" And the crewmate says, "No, look, there they are again." And they both magically appear once again. And Gibbs says, "Heavens help us, Jack. We're doomed." And Jack says, "Oh, don't go panicking just yet." And Gibbs says, "Don't you see? We're being chased by the Condenados. The San Pablo and the San Miguel were twin Spanish ships. Their crews vanished under a full moon. Ever since, the 2 ships have been cursed to sail the seas for eternity. They chase other ships, appearing and disappearing in a desperate hunt that always comes to the same end. If you see them, you are doomed." And Jack says, "That may be so, but we're aboard the fastest ship in the Caribbean. They'll never catch us." And Gibbs says, "I hope not, but they do seem closer now." And then we have some dialogue from the Black Pearl crew, and one of them says, "Yes, they do, don't they?" And another crew member says, "I think so too." And Cotton's parrot then yells out, "Closer!" And then Jack slams his hand down on the rail and says, "Blasted ghost ships! All men to your posts! Let's take advantage of this wind while we can. Let's show these bratty twins what the Black Pearl can do." And then Gibbs asks, "What's the plan?" And Jack says, "As soon as I have one, you'll be the first to know. In the meantime, let's just try to keep them at bay." And then Gibbs says, "Come up with anything yet, Captain?" And Jack says, "If you don't mind, I am in deep thought." And Gibbs says, "Best think deeper. They are right behind us." And then Jack yells out, "Hold fast, men. Let's veer port side." And Jack spins the wheel and the ship begins to turn to the port. And Gibbs yells out, "This is your master plan?" And one of the crew members falls off the rigging while Jack does this maneuver. And someone yells out, "Man overboard!" And the guy who fell into the ocean says, "Come back! Don't leave me here!" And then he sees the twin ships apparently approaching, and he says, "By 1,000 hooks! That can't be! Those are no twin ships! It's a manta ray! And it must be the biggest one that ever swam these seas!" And then we see what everyone thought were 2 ships are actually just the fins of the manta ray sticking out of the water. And then Jack yells out, "Fish 'em out!" And 2 crew members throw over a barrel tied to a rope, and they yell out, "Grab hold, mate!" And then the fins begin to close around the Black Pearl, and Jack says, "This is not good. Gibbs, what kind of monster is this?" And Gibbs yells, "A manta! It's swimming underneath our hull, Captain." And Jack says, "A rather large manta, I'd wager." And Gibbs says, "Did you expect anything smaller in Caribbean waters?" And then the manta ray's tail gets stuck in the rope attached to the anchor, and one of the crew members yells out, "It's hooked to the anchor rope!" And Jack yells, "Quickly, cut that rope or we'll sink!" And the ship begins to heave because of the manta ray under it, and Jack almost falls off the ship, but grabs hold of a rope, and he swings down to the manta ray, and he says, "Oh well, best make the most of the current situation. I've never walked on a manta before. First time for everything, I guess. It's time to go our separate ways now, beastie. It's been brief but memorable. And then he sees something on the manta ray's back, and he says, "What's this? Skull urchins! Blasted parasites! So you're the ones provoking this poor, not-so-little monster. Take that! And that!" And he knocks all these skull urchin creatures off the manta ray's back. And Gibbs yells out, "Cut the rope, Jack! The manta's slowing down!" And Jack yells back, "Rest easy. We become good friends. It's towing us toward that island where the ships attacked by the condenados have been dragged." And Gibbs asks, "What?" And the guy who fell overboard now back on board, and he says, "That was a close call." And then we see the manta ray is pulling the Black Pearl toward an island, of course, as Jack said. And Jack says, "Look at all that treasure. You can see it glistening from here. Cheers, mate. With payment like this, I'll deflea a giant manta sort of thing anytime." And that is the end of the Sails of Doom. This one is pretty fun, and there's a few things I want to point out here. First off, at the beginning of the comic, Gibbs asks Jack how he escaped from Norrington's grasp. This obviously sets the comic after the events of the Curse of the Black Pearl and before Dead Man's Chest. But given Norrington is still hunting Jack, it has to be before the hurricane. If you don't know what the hurricane is, or why I'm referring to a type of storm as like it's a singular event, this hurricane is what led to Norrington losing the Dauntless, and later resigning his commission as Commodore. Go listen to episode 58 if you want to learn more about that event. But we don't exactly know when the hurricane occurred, as the only clue we really have is when Governor Swan says that Norrington resigned his commission some months ago at the beginning of Dead Man's Chest. But to end this tangent, the comic takes place in the first half of the 1-year time gap between the first two Pirates movies. But we see this legend of these dueling ghost ships wreaking havoc is actually a humongous manta ray. And I don't know if you caught it when I was reading it, but Jack fights off what he calls skull urchins from the back of the manta ray. To paint a picture of what these look like for you, they are actually skulls, essentially combined with sea urchins. So they have the pointy spikes that sea urchins have, but these skull urchins are actually alive and have crab-like limbs that let them crawl around. The first thought that came to my mind after seeing these things was, oh my god, these are the exact type of little creatures that would show up in an animated show. They are so unique to Pirates of the Caribbean especially, and given they're a cross between crab, sea urchin, and a literal skull, and the fact their existence is not explained at all in the comic just proves my theory. Obviously, we've talked about the potential Pirates animated show on here a few times before, but these little skull urchins really seem like they were meant to show up in the show if it ever released. Their existence is not explained at all, which gives me the idea that they were supposed to elicit an, "oh, it's these guys" kind of feeling. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but these really seem like they could have shown up in the animated show if that ended up happening. But enough of my rambling, so let's move on to the next comic we are covering today, which is named The Eyes Have It. This appeared in the 4th issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine, and it revolves around the Black Pearl finding a mysterious woman stranded at sea. So let's dive into this one. Alright, so the comic begins with some narration, and it says, "During a fierce storm, a boat is about to meet its end. What if? All is not lost just yet." And this woman is in this boat, storm at sea, and she sees a ship in the distance, and she says, "Is that the Black Pearl?" And then we go on board the Black Pearl, and Gibbs says, "Tell me that was your parrot, Cotton." And Marty says, "Are you afraid of the thunder, or afraid of losing?" And Gibbs says, "No, it's the sea. There's no sea more damned than this one. I've heard that a giant sea serpent lives here, able to swallow a whole ship in one bite." And Marty says, a whole ship?" And Gibbs says, "Aye, crew and all. We should leave these waters as soon as possible, as I don't want to end up in that beast's belly." And Marty says, "Good plan." And then we see the serpent that Gibbs is talking about is actually following the Black Pearl. And Jack comes in and says, "If you're that afraid, you better put these dice away." And Gibbs asks, "Captain?" And Jack says, "Do you know why they call it snake eyes when you roll 2 ones?" And Gibbs says, "Not really. What do you mean?" And Jack says, "In these seas, 2 ones attracts disaster, covered in scales, a hungry beast." And then they're all interrupted by someone on deck yelling, "Captain, on deck, quickly!" And everyone runs out of the captain's cabin, and Jack says, "What is it?" And we see 2 crew members are pulling this woman from the sea. And one of them says, "A shipwrecked woman. We just fished her out." And Jack says, "Interesting. Take her below to dry off." And Gibbs says, "Captain, a woman on board." And Jack says, she looks more like a pirate than a woman. And then we get some more narration that says, the storm is soon over, and the woman soon wakes up. And then we see Jack greeting her, and he says, welcome aboard, miss. And the woman says, I'm Captain Mary Bonny. I lost my ship. And Jack asks, what happened? And Mary says, my crew mutinied against me, left me in the middle of the storm. Cowards, they were too scared to sail with me. And Jack asks, where were you heading? And Mary says, it doesn't matter now. You saved my life. Thank you, Captain. And Jack finishes for Sparrow, Captain Jack Sparrow. And then we see Mary's hand going down to Jack's compass, and she says, so that means I must be aboard the Black Pearl then. And Jack grabs her hand before she can steal the compass, and he says, you're correct, love, but would you mind putting that back where it belongs? And Mary says, I've heard you're not easily fooled. Never mind. And she pulls out a sword, and she says, a sword will help me get what I want. And then Jack asks, so you lost everything because of this compass? And Mary says, yes, the compass that points to what you want most. And Jack says, leave it be while you're still alive, Mary. And Mary says, and you should not underestimate me. She grabs a chair and throws it at Jack. And the two of them are now on deck fighting, and Gibbs says, Jack? And Jack says, stay back, Gibbs. I will deal with the lady myself. And Mary says, I am the most fearsome pirate on the 7 seas. And Jack says, if I were you, I wouldn't brag about that. You see, being a pirate isn't just about being good with a sword. It's much more, Mary. Being a pirate means being free. It means not playing fair. And Jack grabs her sword away from her, and Mary then elbows one of the pirates and steals their pistol and says, speak for yourself, Captain. And then Jack yells out, bugger. And she aims the pistol at Jack and she says, you lost. And she shoots the pistol and it scrapes Jack's shoulder. And he says, I've never seen anyone with such bad aim. And Mary then pulls her sword and puts it at Jack's neck. And she says, or maybe I didn't want to kill you. This way, I'll take control of your crew and maroon you on a deserted island. And then Jack says, I'm afraid you're too late. That's happened to me, twice. And then Jack bites down on the sword with his teeth and yanks it out of Mary's hand. And he says, this game is over. It's your turn to roll. And he throws the pair of dice at Mary. And she says, what? Dice? Are you kidding me? And someone from the crew yells out, snake eyes! And then all of a sudden something rocks the Black Pearl and Mary falls overboard. And we see it's the giant serpent from earlier that was tracking the Black Pearl. And Mary is now hanging from the side of the Black Pearl, and she yells out, I may have lost today, but... And someone yells, watch out! And the serpent is right behind her, literally about to engulf her. And as Mary falls from the Black Pearl, she says, I'll be back! And then Gibbs looks over the rail and says, the serpent, it's gone! And Jack says, it must follow the dice. And then Gibbs asks, so, is it over? And Jack says, no, Gibbs, I don't think so. And then we have some narration that says, a few days later, not too far away. And we see that Mary is still alive and she has just washed up on the shore of an island. And she says, I will find you again, and you will meet your end, Jack Sparrow. And she clutches the dice in her hand. And that is the end of The Eyes Have It. So this one is super cool, and we are introduced to another new character named Mary Bonny. If you couldn't guess by her name, Mary Bonny is obviously influenced by Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who are probably the two most famous female pirates of all time. Obviously the name Mary coming from Mary Read, and the last name Bonny coming from Anne Bonny. But this character of Mary Bonny in this comic is very interesting, as we come to find out that she was a captain mutinied by her crew and deposed as captain. But the whole story seems to have actually been a ruse to gain Jack's favor and steal his compass from him. And also, if it wasn't obvious to you, this comic is set after the Curse of the Black Pearl, given that 1, Jack is on the Black Pearl with Gibbs and Marty, and 2, Jack mentions that he was marooned not once, but twice, which I find funny. That, of course, is referencing the 2 times he was marooned on Rum Runner's Isle. But in addition to this new character, there is also a sea serpent in this comic, which is neat, and according to Jack, seeks out whoever rolls snake eyes. Overall, this comic is super cool, and we of course get the tease that Mary Bonny would show up again. But unfortunately, this was her only comic appearance. I think it would have been super cool to see her pop up again in another comic later down the line, as having another female pirate in the Pirates of the Caribbean roster is always very appreciated by me. But let's move on to the Star of the Seas, which appeared in issue 5 of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in April 2007. In this comic, we find Jack and the crew of the Black Pearl on Vermelha Island in Guinea-Bissau, which is located on the western coast of Africa. And they have all been captured by a rival group of pirates. So let's dive into this one. So the comic, of course, begins with some narration, and it says, "On Vermelha Island in Guinea-Bissau, a typical day in the life of Captain Jack Sparrow and his crew. Well, more or less normal." And we see, of course, Jack and his crew are cornered by a group of pirates, and Jack asks, "Who are you?" And their leader says, "I am the corsair Ikenbow, better known as Black Crow. Surely you must know me." And Jack says, "Sorry, mate, I don't mess with corsairs." And Ikenbow says, "If I were you, I wouldn't joke around. Your troubles have only just begun. Soon we will hand you over to the East India Trading Company. I'll be paid in gold equal to your weight. However, they did not tell me how you should be delivered, dead or alive." And Jack asks him, "So you want gold, rubies, pearls, or diamonds?" And the Black Crow says, "Anyone who doesn't need those is not worthy of being called a pirate." And Jack says, "All right, tell me, how much is my crew worth? 2 guineas each? I've recruited them in the worst ports in the Caribbean." And the Black Crow says, "Enough, Sparrow. I won't let your crew go, even if Lord Beckett only wants you alone." Then Jack says, "What if I offer you something even more valuable? Something Beckett can only dream of, like a diamond the size of a cannonball, perhaps." And the Black Crow says, "What are you talking about?" And Jack says to him, "It's the Star of the Seas, the largest diamond in the world, which just happens to be located on this island. A diamond in exchange for freedom for me, my crew, and my ship." And the Black Crow says, "It's a deal. As soon as I get the diamond, I will lower the red flag on my ship, and the company ships won't come." And Jack says, "Perfect." Then we get some narration that says, Jack, Gibbs, Black Crow Bow, and 2 of his men head inland, where they soon see. And Jack says, "The Devil's Mouth. It leads directly to the belly of the devil, where the star is kept." And Ikenbow says, "So what are we waiting for? Let's go." And Gibbs says nervously, This thing, it's not alive, is it, Jack?" And Jack says, "I hope not, Gibbs, although it's best we won't make any noise, just in case." And they all go inside. And once they're inside, they come up to a labyrinth, and Gibbs says, "A labyrinth." And Ikenbow says, "What's your plan, Sparrow? If you're trying to escape, know that neither you nor your friend will leave here alive." And Jack says, "Don't be so suspicious. Besides, this path is not hard to follow. Just make sure to never follow these skeleton signs, unless they're alive, of course. However, you need to be sure that the signs are not fake. Only the not fake signs point the right way. Savvy?" And then we see everyone's confused by Jack's logic here. And then, out of nowhere, they get to the end of the labyrinth, and Jack says, "Well, here we are." And then we hear a mysterious voice say, "Only you could do this." And then Jack says, "Oya, my dear, how are you?" And Oya says, "Not so well, Captain Sparrow." And then Gibbs says, "Oya, you mean the witch Oya? The African queen?" And Jack says to him, "Yes, but she's not as scary as she looks." And then Jack says to Oya, "I found myself nearby and thought, why not pay a visit to the most beautiful—" And then Oya interrupts him and says, "Flattery will not help you. You came for this." And she holds out the diamond. And Ikenbow's crew sees the diamond, but he tells them to stop, and he says, "Don't shoot until I give the signal. I want to know what our dear Captain Jack is up to." And then Oya says, "You seem to have forgotten how I feel about you. So let me remind you." And she douses the diamond in water. And Jack says, "Uh-oh, Gibbs, I think I was wrong." Then Oya says, "You aren't getting out of here alive, Jack." And then we see what looks like a bunch of ghosts heading toward them. And Jack pulls out his sword and yells, "Defend yourselves, even if you seem to be hitting nothing." And Ikenbow yells out, "What are they?" And Gibbs says, "They're ghosts." And one of Ikenbow's crew yells, "Captain Bow, what do we do?" And the Black Crow says, "We will not surrender. I will not leave the diamond here." And Gibbs yells out, "Jack!" And we see Jack is surrounded, and he says, "Uh-oh, I'm surrounded." And he runs right through one of the guys, because they're, obviously, you can phase right through them. And he says to Oya, "I'm sorry for what happened between us, Oya. If only things had been different." And Oya says, "I hate you." And Jack says to her, "I couldn't stay with you." And Oya says, "But I loved you." And Jack says, "I know, but Captain Jack loves his freedom too much. See you again soon." And then we get some narration that says, the diamond, then taken out of the water, loses its magical power. And Jack steals the diamond and yells, let's go, Gibbs! It's time to get out of here! And Oya yells to them, next time, Jack, I will not spare you! And then we see Ike and Val's crew are still preoccupied with all of the ghosts who are no longer ghosts. And one of them yells out, they become flesh again! We can kill them all! And then one of them sees Jack running away, and he says, Sparrow is getting away! And Ike and Val yells, stop! I won't let you go with the diamond! I'll catch you, and I'll hang you from the yardarm of my mast! And then we see Ike and Val and his crew get lost in the labyrinth. And they say, now what? Where do we go? And then we leave them and meet back up with Jack and Gibbs, who are still running away. And Gibbs says, we were on the verge of death, Jack! And Jack says, don't celebrate yet, Gibbs. We escaped from the Black Crow, but now we need to escape his crew. And they fight off the rest of Black Crow's crew, and Gibbs says, let's get back to the Black Pearl, and let's get out of here with the diamond. And Jack says, there's just one issue, Gibbs. We have an even bigger problem now. And then we see the East India Trading Company ships are encroaching on the Black Pearl. And Jack says, let's get back to the Black Pearl. I know what to do. And then we see Jack and the crew back on the Black Pearl, and Marty says, the East India Trading Company, they're surrounding us. And Gibbs says, Jack, their guns will fire soon. What are we going to do? And Jack yells, let go all sails. We're going to sail right toward them. And Jack swings off the side of the Pearl down to the waterline. And the diamond in his hand, he puts it under the water, and he says, and let's hope that luck smiles upon us. And then the narration says, suddenly, thanks to the Star of the Seas, the Black Pearl disappears from sight right in front of the East India Trading Company, slipping past the ships like a shadow, and making an incredible maneuver. And then Gibbs yells out, incredible! I don't know how, but we made it. And Jack says, it's all thanks to the star. No one could ever imagine the power of this stone when it's submerged in water. You know, people will tell legends about this for many, many years to come, with each one embellishing it in their own way. This will be the incredible story of how Captain Jack Sparrow almost... Oops! And then we see a bird comes down and grabs the diamond right out of Jack's hand. And as the bird flies away, Gibbs yells out, the star! We must! And Jack interrupts him and says, never mind it, Gibbs. There are countless more magical rocks in the ocean, and for us, it's just the beginning. And that is the end of the Star of the Seas. This one introduces a few new characters and the title treasure named the Star of the Seas. This is a huge diamond with a specific magical power. When the diamond is submerged in water, it is able to make whoever holding it, or I assume anything in close proximity, disappear and essentially become a type of ghost, where they are still visible, but they can phase through things and not be hit by attacks. A pretty cool power, but unfortunately Jack loses it in a very comical way at the end of the comic, having it stolen by a bird. And speaking of birds, one of the characters introduced in this comic is a corsair named Ike and Val, better known as his nickname, Black Crow. He's a neat character, but we also have another character introduced here named Oya, who is an African witch queen. We also see she has some past history with Jack Sparrow, and overall, the new characters introduced here are super, super cool, and the comic as a whole is really fun. So let's now move on to the next comic, which is named Tears of the Goddess, and this appeared in issue 7 of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in September 2007. This comic starts off with Jack Sparrow having just stolen a vial containing the tears of the goddess Kali. Kali, of course, is one of the most significant Hindu deities, and she is associated with time, death, and destruction. But what is super cool about this comic is that we get an appearance from a very significant person in Jack Sparrow's life. So let's read through this one. So the comic begins, of course, with some narration that says, the Indian Ocean at sunset. And Jack says, Dear Seagull, you stand before the greatest pirate of all time. Captain Jack Sparrow has returned from yet another incredible adventure across the ocean. Here are the tears of the goddess Kali, stolen from the island of Great Goa. What do you think? Impressive? And the seagull flies away, and Jack says, well, it was nice talking to you while you were on my crew. Then we see a giant smoke cloud coming up from behind Jack's dinghy, and it soon overwhelms him, and Jack says, what? If you want to fight, Shadow, then fight. And then we see a bunch of spears pop out from the smoke cloud. And Jack says, oh, how about we negotiate? And then once the whole smoke cloud envelops Jack, he sees there's a giant ship inside the smoke cloud. And he says, curious, This is the Black Fire, and you are the Shadow Pirates. And one of the crewmen on board says, "You are correct. Get on board, and we will take you back to Great Goa, and your crimes will be judged by the Baron." And then they make their way to the temple, and Jack says, "Not a bad place. A little gloomy, but..." And he's interrupted by one of the guards, and he says, "Shut up! Keep moving." And then they go inside the main chamber, and we see the leader here says, "Welcome, I am Akshay, and this is the end of the road for you." And Jack says, "I guess I should introduce myself." And Akshay says, "Don't bother. You are Jack Sparrow. No one else would have dared to come this far." And Jack corrects him and says, "Captain Jack Sparrow. And since we've just met, why don't we talk business?" And Akshay says, "The Tears of Kali, Jack." And Jack says to him, "Ah, yes, that's it. How about we negotiate? In your hands is my freedom, and in mine is something that may interest you." And Akshay says, "A compass that points the way to what you want most?" And Jack is surprised by this. And Akshay says, "Yes, I've heard of it, but I already have what I need. I wouldn't know what to do with the rest. So this is the end." And Jack says, "Wait a minute, we just started to negotiate." And Akshay points a pistol at Jack and says, "Oh, I'm not going to kill you." And Jack says, "Lucky me." And one of Akshay's guards says, "Luck? You're the first person to consider it lucky to fall into a bottomless pit." Now we see Jack, of course, is now on the edge of this pit, and Akshay says, "Goodbye, Sparrow. Do you know what they say about this prison?" And Jack says, "I'd rather be stranded on a desert island." And they push Jack down the hole, and Akshay says, "Anyone who can reach the moon can escape, but I doubt you can fly, and the only thing left for you to do is fall." And Jack falls into the bottomless pit. And then a little while later, Jack wakes up, and he hears a voice that he recognizes. And the voice says, "You all right, son?" And Jack looks up, and he sees Edward Teague. And he says, "Dad?" And Teague says, "Captain Teague, you should know that." And Jack looks up, and he says, "I'm a little out of sorts, but I'm alive. I'm not sure why." And Teague says, "This pit is not as deep as it looks. Too deep to get out of, but shallow enough not to die." And Jack asks Teague, "What are you doing here? Has someone broken the code?" And Teague says, "Yes, Akshay stole the piratic codex, and you will help me get it back. So now our destinies are entwined. Pirate secrets will become known to everyone." And then Jack says, "So he wants to give the code to the East India Trading Company in exchange for control of the Indian Ocean." And Teague says, "Only you and I can prevent this. Let's get out of here and stop Akshay, even if it seems impossible." And Jack says, "Of course, right away, and I will get the Tears of Kali back, and I think I've figured out how to get out of here." Akshay said the way out is to reach the moon. For the greatest pirate, nothing could be easier. And he realizes there's a secret door down in this pit. And Teague says, "I must admit, I'm impressed." And Jack says, "I'll tell you my secret. Always remember to believe in luck." And then we go out into the hallway of the temple, and one of the guards says to some others, "Take the prisoners' weapons on board. I will return the tears to the temple." Then out of nowhere, Jack and Teague jump out of the secret door behind the wall, and Jack yells, "No way!" And he knocks this guard down and knocks him out. And then Jack says, "Look at that! The tears are mine again." And Teague says, "It's time to take back the codex, the old-fashioned way." And Jack says, "I can't. I have a secret. Never follow the path destined for you." And Teague says, "You can't run from fate forever, Jackie." And Teague continues, "Being a pirate means more than robbing ships and staying alive." And then we see Teague is now alone, and he's cornered by Akshay and his men. And Akshay says, "He must not leave alive. Shadows, take the book from him." And then right before Akshay is about to take out Teague with his sword, we see someone intervenes right between them. And it is actually none other than Jack Sparrow, hidden behind one of the masks that the Shadow Pirates use. And Teague says, "Son?" And Jack says, "Another secret. Never do what you told others you were intending to do." And then now Teague and Jack are fighting together, and Teague says, "The candles. Fire is the only way to escape here." And Teague shoots his pistol, knocks the candles over, and essentially lights everything on fire. And as Teague and Jack escape, Akshay yells, Curse you, Teague! Curse you, Jack Sparrow!" And then we go a little bit later, and the narration says, "Near Madagascar at dawn." And Teague says, "Thanks to you, the pirate secrets have been saved. I should also thank you for something else." And Jack says, "For what? Helping you become a real pirate?" And Teague says, "No, for this. I've been searching for them for so long. And we see that Teague has actually stolen the tears of Kali from Jack. And Jack says, "Kali's tears!" And Teague says, "Now, Jack Sparrow, I have proven to you that I am the greatest pirate on the planet." And as Teague sails away in his little boat, Jack pulls out his compass and says, "We'll see about that, Dad." And that is the end of Tears of the Goddess. So the coolest part of this one, of course, is the appearance of none other than Captain Edward Teague, who of course is Jack Sparrow's father. And at the end, Teague even outsmarts Jack and steals the tears from him. But this comic is neat and introduces us to the Shadow Pirates and their leader, who is named Akshay. Now, if you know the names of minor pirate side characters, you may be thinking, isn't that the name of one of Sri Sambhaji's aides in At World's End? Well, no, but their names are very similar. The name of Sri Sambhaji's aide is Askay, and the character in this comic is named Akshay. Very similar names, but this comic is actually set after the events of At World's End, given that Jack is on his own in his little dinghy that we see him in at the end of the movie and at the beginning of this comic. But I love that Teague shows up in this comic, as it is his one and only comic appearance, and we also get some fun moments between him and Jack. But next up we have one of my personal favorites, and that is Island of Fortune. This appeared in issue 8 of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in November 2007. And what is super cool about this one is it actually takes place before the Curse of the Black Pearl. And no, not right before, way before. I'm talking before Barbossa's mutiny. So that makes this one really, really cool. And not only that, we also get an appearance from another Pirates movie character, that being none other than Bootstrap Bill Turner. This is Bootstrap Bill's only comic appearance, and I was super excited seeing him in this one when I first found these comics. But, as the name suggests, this comic revolves around Jack trying to find the Island of Fortune, an island that supposedly has the power of bestowing everlasting luck on a person. So let's go into this one. So, like all the others, the comic begins with some narration that says, "A ship is sailing across the Arabian Sea at full sail, and she's being pursued by the Black Pearl." And then we see Bootstrap Bill on the helm, and Jack says, "Keep up the good work, Mr. Turner. You there, raise the sails. Catch the wind, you bilge rats." And Bootstrap says to Jack, "Captain, they're moving fast." And Jack says, "Not faster than us, Bootstrap. The Caliph will not escape. After all, I am Captain Jack Sparrow." And then we go back in time, and the narration says, a few days earlier, at Mocha Bay in the Red Sea. And we see Jack is in a tavern talking to a mysterious pirate. And this pirate says, "What good is your word to me? Never trust a pirate. I should know. I am Rajiv Kamar, the oldest pirate in the world. I doubt I will tell you what you want to know." And Jack says to him, "I offer you something else." And Jack pulls out something from his vest, and Rajiv says, "The breath of the North Star. That belonged to the Caliph of Dhofar. How did you manage to—" And Jack interrupts him and says, "Well, now the Caliph knows never to trust a pirate." And Rajiv says, "You have a dangerous enemy, Jack." And Jack puts the breath of the North Star on the table, and he says, "Where is it? Where is the Island of Fortune?" And Rajiv says, "If you want to find the secret of fortune and cheat death, you must be prepared to face misfortune." And he gives Jack a map, and Jack says, "I'm ready. Show me the secret." And Rajiv says, "All right, here is the map to the island you seek." And as Jack leaves with the map, Rajiv says, "Just know that luck and misfortune are two sides of the same coin." And then we see a mysterious man who has been lurking in the back of the tavern. He grabs hold of Rajiv and takes the breath of the North Star. And he says, "That's strange. That's what I always tell my people in Dhofar." And this man pulls out a knife, and he says, "Rajiv, why are you so afraid of the secret of fortune?" And we see, of course, this is the Caliph of Dhofar, the guy that Jack stole the breath of the North Star from. And as the Caliph of Dhofar asks Rajiv where the island is located, we go back to Jack and the crew of the Black Pearl, who are just making their way to the Island of Fortune. And Jack, Bootstrap, and a few pirates are in a rowboat going to shore. And Jack says, "About 300 paces forward. Wait for us while Bootstrap and I go take a walk." So then Jack says to Bootstrap, "Thieving, old maps, hunts for lost treasure. Would you ever trade this life for another?" And Bootstrap says, "Of course not, Jack. I love this life." And they find a tent on the island, and Jack pulls the curtain and goes inside, and he says, "You know what I love most, Bill? The surprises that life has in store. And then we see there's a woman in here along with a bunch of incense and things around her. And Jack says, I have never seen a more attractive treasure keeper. And this mysterious woman, she says, my name is Ranja. What are you looking for here? And Jack says, I came to put my life on the line and find out the secret that will make me the luckiest pirate ever. And Ranja says, do you know what you are going to have to face? And Jack says, some kind of misfortune, but I am not afraid. So Ranja then pulls out a scroll, and she says, well then, here are the 3 magic symbols of the island, and this tattoo will help you understand the secret of luck. So Jack then pulls off his shirt and exposes his back, and we see he gets tattooed with something on his back, completely covering his back, along with the sides of his arms. And Jack says, just a tattoo? And Ranja says, these are magical symbols. With them, and then out of nowhere, the Caliph of Dafar enters the room and says, you'll meet your fate. And Jack says, the Caliph of Dafar. And the Caliph says, surrender. You cannot fool me. Your fortune does not work in your favor. She is my slave now. And Jack says, I'm afraid, Caliph, you're too late. And the Caliph says, not at all. The real treasure of this island's luck is made of flesh and blood. And then Jack says, what? Ranja is the fortune? And the tattoo? And the Caliph says to Jack, that tattoo brings bad luck. And then we go back to the present where the Black Pearl is chasing down the Caliph's ship. And one of the Black Pearl crew says, a storm, Captain. We can't catch them. And Jack says, everything is under control. And then we see a hole that emerges in the sail of the Black Pearl. And one of the guys yells out, the sail! And Jack looks up and says, well, more or less. And then we see a lightning strike strikes the hull of the Black Pearl, leaving a gaping hole in it. And Bootstrap looks down and says, bad luck is cursing us, Jack. We better give up the chase and let them go with the girl. And Jack says, never, Bill, even in the face of death. And Jack walks over to one of the lines holding one of the sails down, and he says, I won't give up because of such an insignificant. Then the wind then blows super hard, blowing Jack and the sail up into the air, and Jack yells out, breeze! And then we see the Caliph and his crew on the ship. They yell out, Caliph, look! Incredible, but he won't make it. And the Caliph says, now he is the unluckiest pirate I've ever seen. And on the way down, Jack stabs his sword into the hull of the Caliph's ship. And he says, not at all. I'm the luckiest there is. Then Jack climbs up the side and says, you will always remember this as the day, Captain. And he tries to shoot his pistol, and he sees it's empty. And he says, empty? Maybe I am unlucky. And the Caliph's crew yell out, grab him. He's unarmed. And then Jack smacks him with the butt of his pistol. And the Caliph says, ha ha, an end worthy of such a foolish pirate. And Ranja says, I'm sorry. And Jack says to her, you deceived me when you were in danger. Pirates do the same thing. And as Jack is fighting off the Caliph's crew, the Caliph is still holding Ranja captive. And he says, did you return because I stole the treasure, or because you didn't know it was in your hands? And Jack says, no, Caliph, because the most precious thing is freedom, above all else. And he throws a dagger right at the Caliph, and the Caliph says, you missed. That was your last throw. And Jack says, indeed, only I didn't miss. And the Caliph says, what? And he sees the dagger actually pierced the vial of the breath of the North Star, and it begins to leak. And then the Caliph yells out, no! Now everything will be covered in ice from the breath of the North Star. And he begins to freeze, and Jack says, yes, but I will survive. And he grabs hold of Ranja, and they both swing off the side of the ship, and Ranja says, maybe not. And as they escape, the Caliph and his whole ship begins to freeze frozen solid. And once Jack and Ranja are on board the Pearl, Bootstrap comes over and says, welcome back on board, Captain. And Jack says, weren't we sinking? And Bootstrap says, not while she's on board. And Jack turns around and sees the massive, essentially ice sculpture behind them now, and he says, they didn't seem to have much luck, by the way. And then Ranja says, how about a tattoo? Then we go back over to Jack in the little tent getting a new tattoo. And Ranja says, you saved my life, and in my gratitude, with this spell I will take away its power. And then we see an inscription here that says, leaving behind success and failure, fear and apprehension, you will rise on the wings of adventure and cross the boundaries of the world, rushing into the unknown. And Ranja says, you will be neither lucky nor unlucky, just Captain Jack Sparrow. And Jack says to her, Jack Sparrow, now I know I can fight even with bad luck on my side, and win. And as Jack walks away, Ranja bids him farewell and says, "Farewell, Captain." And that is the end of Island of Fortune. So there's a few things I want to talk about in this comic. I already mentioned that Bootstrap Bill appears here, and I love getting to see him in the Swashbucklers art style. But the weird thing is that he looks different throughout the comic, which is some kind of an error, I think. On the first page, he looks completely different than how he appears throughout the rest of the comic. I'm not sure why that is. Nonetheless, it is super cool that he shows up here, and also kind of interesting as he says that he loves the pirate life, which kind of goes against his personality in the Legends of the Brethren Court book series. In that series, if you read the books or listened to the episodes I did covering them, all Bootstrap wants is to get home to his wife and his son William, and he constantly asks Jack to take him home, but Jack always shrugs him off or gets distracted. This comic, I would assume, takes place after that series, but Barbossa, of course, does not appear in this comic, which doesn't really make much sense. Barbossa was, of course, in the Legends of the Brethren Court book series, and this comic would have to take place after the book series, given that at the beginning of it, Jack sees Bootstrap for the first time in years. But anyway, back to my original point, Bootstrap never really enjoyed the pirate life, as we know from the books, but in this comic, he tells Jack that he loves it. A bit of a plot hole, but hey, this series has a billion plot holes, so it doesn't really matter too much. However, there's another major thing that we see take place in this comic, and that is actually Jack receiving his massive back tattoo, as I pointed out earlier. This is super cool, and the main reason I love this comic. Now, the only time you'll see this tattoo in the movies is during the multiple Jack sequence in At World's End, where Jack is hallucinating in Davy Jones' locker. One of the Jack Sparrows is shirtless, and you can see some quick shots of this massive tattoo covering his back and also on his arms. But this tattoo is something called the Desiderata, which is a poem written by Max Ehrmann, published in 1927. Obviously, that is 200 years after Jack Sparrow's time, but according to the POTC wiki, the Desiderata is a poem that Johnny Depp himself has stated he tries to live by, which would explain why Jack has this specifically tattooed on his back. That also goes for the tattoos on Jack Sparrow's arms, which are actually from a 1939 play called The Time of Your Life, which is also another piece of media that is very inspiring to Johnny Depp, according to the wiki. And obviously neither of these existed in the age of piracy, but it's still super cool regardless. But back to the comic, we see Ranja tattooing this exact same tattoo we see in the movie on Jack's back and arms. I love that we get to see the origin of this tattoo in this comic, and we see Jack originally thinks it's blessing him with good luck, before he finds out he was deceived. But at the end of the comic, Ranja removes the power of the tattoo, and it almost looks like the tattoo essentially dissipates in Jack's skin, as you can still kind of see it, but it looks like it's fading away. It's unclear if she was removing the tattoo or not, but I assume she just removed its power, given that Jack still has the tattoo later on in life. And the snippet of the tattoo that is shown on the last page of the comic does match with the vibe that the Desiderata poem gives off, but it's actually not from the Desiderata. I'm assuming it was just made up for this comic, or maybe it could have been pulled from the poem, and after translating it to other languages, and then, of course, translating it back to English, maybe that's why it's different, but still super awesome regardless, and getting to see the origin of Jack's back tattoo is super, super cool. The next comic, though, is the Shanghai Tigers, and this appeared in the 9th issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in January 2008. This comic is really fun, and obviously from the title, it takes place in Shanghai. But this is the story of Jack looking for a flag that has the power to make whatever ship flying it unsinkable. And in the process, Jack discovers a secret sect of pirates called the Shanghai Tigers, who do not respect the pirate code. So let's dive into this comic. So the comic begins with Jack Sparrow telling a story to a pack of seagulls. And he says, "My friends, as we sail in search of the Fountain of Youth, I will tell you a story that happened a long time ago, in Shanghai." And then we, of course, flash back to this adventure in Shanghai, and Jack's narration continues, and he says, "That day, among the junks and Chinese pirates, there was me, Captain Jack Sparrow. I was looking for a flag with a red tiger. Whatever ship flies the flag would become invincible." And then we see Jack is disguised among Mistress Ching's crew, and one of her men looks at Jack and says, "You are not Chinese." And Jack says to him, "Well, my relative has a quarter of a half of a third part of the blood of my cousin, who is 100% Chinese." And the narration continues as this guard is completely confused by what Jack said. And Jack says in the narration, "The flag was in the possession of the Shanghai Tigers, who did not respect the code. I didn't know where they were, but the pirate lord of the Pacific Ocean, Mistress Ching, was their worst enemy. And more than anything, they wanted to get their hands on her gold. But that night..." And then we see Jack hiding behind one of the masts, and he sees the Shanghai Tigers going on board Mistress Ching's ship. And the leader of the Tigers says, "Move it, Tigers." And Jack sees this, and he thinks, here they are, with Kang, Ching's first mate. And the Tigers then go below deck, and Jack follows them down. And he says, they disappeared. They took the gold, but they left behind the legendary POW mask. But right before Jack can grab the mask, a sword points at his neck, and the mysterious voice says, "Looking for something, stranger?" And Jack says, "Well, no, but since I'm here, I want to join you." And one of the Tigers says, "I don't believe him. He's looking for this, too." And the guy holds up Mistress Ching's piece of 8. And Jack says, "I wouldn't even know what to do with broken glasses." Then Kang says, "This is one of the pieces of 8 belonging to the pirate lords. They will help us conquer the Brethren Court, and then the world." And Jack says, "Great, I like it. I could help you." And Kang swings at him and says, "I don't think so, pirate." And as they make all this noise down below deck, the pirates above deck then hear this, and they say, "What's going on? It's coming from the hold." And Kang says, "Blast!" And one of Ching's loyal pirates says, "Raise the alarm!" And Kang yells at Jack, "You did this!" And Jack says, "My fault, mate. Maybe I can fix this." So then the Tigers and Ching's crew then begin to fight one another. And one of the Tigers says, "There are too many of them." But Jack continues and says, "By helping you, get out of here." And he steals a spear from one of Ching's men, and he uses it to essentially pole vault himself over to another ship. And he yells back to Kang and the rest of the Tigers, "Hurry up!" And Kang says, "You're not a fool, stranger. Catch this." And he throws Jack a sword. And Jack yells out, "Where is your junk?" And Kang says, "The next one on the left." And once Kang, Jack, and the rest of the Tigers are on board their ship, Kang yells, "We're here! Let's get ready to sail!" Then Kang begins to fire one of their cannons at Ching's junk. And he says, "What do you think of the Tiger's firepower?" Then Jack looks up and sees the flag he's looking for flying from Kang's junk ship. And he says, "How are you going to get away from Mistress Ching's fleet?" And Kang says, "Have you heard of the Red Tiger flag? The ship flying this flag is unsinkable and untouchable." And then we see the ship that's flying the flag actually begins to fly. And the ship that they're on begins to literally rise out of the ocean. And Jack says, "You don't see something like this every day." And then we see Mistress Ching on board her ship, and she says, "Jack Sparrow is on board that junk. I can hear the sound of his piece of 8. And one of Ching's men says, "He's with Kang. They have the Red Tiger flag, and they're going to..." And then as Ching's junk begins to fire at Kang's ship, it continues to rise into the air. And Jack says, "Very interesting." And Kang says, "That's not all. No force can sink a ship while this flag is above it. And now, thanks for your help, but we don't need you anymore. With these glasses, we'll conquer the seas." And Jack says, "I'm fed up with your nonsense. One more thing, traitor. Trying to conquer the seas, and you don't follow the code, and you threaten the pirate lords. This is the worst thing you could do in front of me. Because I..." And Kang says, "Because you..." And Jack pulls out his sword and says, "I am Captain Jack Sparrow, pirate lord of the Caribbean." And then Jack, this whole time, has been essentially fighting them, and he sets off one of Kang's cannons, and it shoots right through the mast, ripping down the Red Tiger flag. And Kang says, "The mast and the flag! What have you done?" And the whole ship begins to fall back toward the ocean, and it slams into the water, and the flag falls overboard. And Kang yells, "The Red Tiger flag! It can't sink!" And Jack says, "Leave it, mate. Such is its fate, and mine is to get out of here." And he grabs Mistress Ching's piece of 8 before he jumps off the ship right before it explodes. And then in the aftermath, Mistress Ching says, "Well done, Captain Jack Sparrow. The last time we saw each other was when I stole Pal's mask from you. Where is it now?" And Jack says, "It sank, Ching, just like everything else, but I will return your piece of 8. And Ching says, "Why did you give up the flag?" And Jack says, "I never set out to conquer the seas." And Mistress Ching says, "Very wise. Goodbye, Jack Sparrow." But Jack then continues what he was saying after he's alone, and he says, "But to find the treasures across them." And we see that he did keep the PAL mask from her ship. And then we go back to present day, and Jack says, "That's it, mates. And now I will tell you how I lost the mask. It all started on a rainy day in Nassau." And that is the end of the Shanghai Tigers. This one is super fun, and I love how Jack is in disguise among Mistress Ching's crew at the beginning. And speaking of Mistress Ching, this is her only comic appearance, and it is very cool seeing her show up. We also get the reveal that her first mate, Kang, is actually the leader of the Shanghai Tigers, and they were trying to steal her piece of 8 so they can begin to conquer the seas. We also get to see the power of the red tiger flag, which is what Jack was originally intending to find. At the beginning of the story, we learned the flag makes the ship it's flying from unsinkable, and that is because it essentially gives that ship the ability to fly. And now what you might have noticed is that this comic is a flashback to earlier in the timeline, as the beginning of the comic is set after At World's End, given that Jack is in his dinghy searching for the Fountain of Youth. As to when the actual Shanghai part of the story took place, I am not entirely sure. Given that the Black Pearl is nowhere to be seen in this comic, I am thinking that it might be set in the 10-year time gap between Barbossa's mutiny and the movie The Curse of the Black Pearl, which makes sense given that Jack says it took place a long time ago. Nonetheless, this comic is a very fun story. But next up we have The Black Heart of the Pearl, and this appeared in the 10th issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in February 2008. The story has Jack Sparrow teaming up with a Navy officer wrongly accused of piracy to find a lost coin that apparently serves as the heart of the Black Pearl. This comic takes place before The Curse of the Black Pearl, as Jack is actively searching for the Black Pearl at this point in time, so it is after he has been marooned by Barbossa. And the reason he goes looking for this coin is because he hears that whoever has the coin has ownership over the Black Pearl. This one is super fun, so let's dive right into it. So we begin with some narration, and it says, "Pirates are terribly afraid of White Island, because no one has ever returned from there. This place houses the Royal Navy's darkest prison, and this is exactly where one of our friends finds himself, set out in search of his ship." And we see Jack Sparrow is being sent into this prison, and he walks up to the guard and he says, "Captain Jack Sparrow, nice to meet you." And the big burly prison guard only gurs at him. And then we go to a little bit later once Jack is inside his cell, and his cellmate says, "I never heard of you." And Jack says, "You've never heard of the one and only captain of the Black Pearl?" And his cellmate says, "Never, sir. I'm fed up with pirates. I was arrested by the Royal Navy because of them." And Jack asks, "How did you get into such a mess?" And this guy says, "They thought I was a pirate because I knew their legends. And I joined the Navy to experience these legends and freely cross the borders of the world. And now, here I am in this dungeon. However, I have heard stories about this Black Pearl." And Jack says, "And about the famous Captain Jack Sparrow." And the guy says, "No, I heard something else. Something about her black heart." And Jack is intrigued by this, so this guy continues the story. And he says, "The builders hid a coin in the heart of the ship, but the heart of the Black Pearl was hidden by Davy Jones in the cave of the Red Turtle. The one who holds the heart of the pearl owns the ship. That's just a legend, though." And Jack says, "Interesting. Another reason to get out of here quickly." And we see that he actually has the Ring of Keys. And once both of them are out of their cell, Jack says, "It's time to part. Good luck to you, mate." And the guy says, "May I come with you, Captain? I want to share in the adventures I've only heard about. I can be of use to you. I was a naval officer." And Jack says, "I guess you're right. What's your name?" And the guy says, "Samuel Rackham, Captain Sparrow." So the two of them begin to make their escape, and Sam Rackham says to the guard, "Captain Norrington wants to see this pirate on the scaffold." And Jack says, "You can help me get some sort of ship. I need to find the heart." And Samuel says, "Don't get your hopes up. I'll hand you over to Norrington, and then I can return to the Navy." And then we go to a little bit later with Jack and Samuel on a ship they stole from the Navy. And Jack sees a whole fleet of Navy ships behind them, and he says, "They showed up faster than I expected." And the Navy ships begin to fire upon them, and Samuel says, "They're going to sink us." And Jack says, "You see, Sam, it's not in their best interest to capture us alive." But we're not interested in getting caught either. Tie yourself to the mast. And Sam says, aren't we going to save ourselves? And Jack says, we'll let them sink us. How else are we supposed to get into the cave of the Red Turtle? The legendary abyss at the bottom of the sea. And we see that their ship sinks, and Jack and Sam are tied to the mast, and they essentially sink down to this giant bubble under the sea. And they go inside, and of course there's air in there. And Jack says, it's incredible. Welcome to the graveyard of sunken ships. Any ship that comes out of here becomes cursed. And Samuel says, there's water all around us. Incredible. And Jack says, always listen to the legends. They don't lie. Then they walk over to this giant turtle structure where the coin is being held. And Jack says, finally, the black heart of the pearl. And then Samuel yells out, Captain, watch out. And we see a bunch of cursed undead pirates coming toward them. And Jack says, you must have been pirates. You refused to serve Davy Jones, and he punished you. This type won't accept no for an answer. And they all begin to fight. And Jack says, you have to do what I do, and tell them yes, meaning no. And Jack stabs one of the skeletons. And he says to Samuel, it seems they won't leave us alone until the heart is returned to its place, Sam. After all, taking possession of the heart of the pearl was never my goal. And Jack throws the coin out of the big air bubble into the water. And Jack says, I wanted her to be free. We see all the cursed pirates then begin to run away from them. And Samuel says, they're leaving. And Jack says, they're looking for the heart, and we need to get out of here. Although I don't know how. And Samuel says, I do. After all, don't all of these cursed ships leave from here? And then we go back to the surface on one of the Navy ships, and one of the officers says to his captain, we've searched the entire area, sir. We have found no survivors. And the captain says, because there are no survivors, Burke. Jack Sparrow and that traitor boy rest at the bottom of the ocean. And then we see as they're saying this, Jack and Samuel are on a ship rising from the depths of the ocean. And the captain of the Navy ship says, I am sure we will not see them again. And the officer says, Captain, look! And the ship sprouts out of the water with Jack and Samuel on it. And the crew of the Navy ship says, we must be off course! A cursed ship! And then Jack says to the cursed crew, thanks for the lift. And now, perhaps, it's time for us to go, before you attack us again. So we then see Jack and Samuel in a rowboat. And Jack says, rising from the bottom of the sea aboard a cursed ship, an act worthy of a pirate. And Samuel says, I'm not a pirate, Jack. And he pulls out a pistol from his jacket. And Jack says, and are you going to prove that by turning me in? And Samuel then throws the pistol into the water, and he says, no, you saved my life, and gave me a real adventure, a pirate adventure. It's a shame you lost the heart of the pearl. And Jack says, I never lost it. The heart of a ship is always in the heart of its captain, and now it belongs to the sea. Well, Sam, off to Tortuga. We'll part there. And Samuel says, and then where, Captain? And Jack says, back to the sea, less hearts and more friends. And that is the end of the Black Heart of the Pearl. I love this one, and there is a lot that goes down here. First off, we have a new character introduced here named Samuel Rackham. And as I said earlier, he was a Navy officer who was imprisoned because he knew pirate lore. At the start, we see that he was first planning to hand Jack over to Norrington so he could get back on good graces with the Navy. But by the end of the comic, he thanks Jack for saving his life and sails with him to Tortuga. Now, the whole basis of this comic revolves around the Black Heart of the Pearl, which is a coin that was placed in the ship when it was being built. But the coin was taken by Davy Jones and hidden in this cave of the Red Turtle. Given the history of the Black Pearl, this does not make too much sense. Of course, we know the Black Pearl started out as an EITC merchant ship named the Wicked Wench, and it was burned down and then raised up by Davy Jones. Go read The Price of Freedom or listen to my episodes covering it to learn more about that. So we know there's no magical coin that was built into the Black Pearl, but this is a relatively common practice when building ships. So maybe there was a coin built into the Wicked Wench, and we could say that Davy Jones took the coin maybe as some type of payment when he raised it for Jack. But we also get to see a cool ship graveyard inside this bubble under the ocean, where a bunch of cursed sailors ambush Jack and Sam. Overall, this comic is very fun, and one of my favorites from this bunch. Up next is The Return of Jack Sparrow, which appeared in issue 11 of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in March 2008. This comic starts with the crew of the Black Pearl unable to find Jack Sparrow, and they go on a wild goose chase to find what happened to him. This one is really fun and has a lot of flashbacks and neat moments throughout, so let's get right into it. So the comic begins with some narration that says, "In the Caribbean Sea on Crab Island." And Marty says, "What happened?" And Gibbs says, "This is bad, mates. Jack has disappeared into thin air." And Cotton's parrot yells out, "Captain Jack!" And Marty says, "But how? We landed here 2 days ago in search of Suarez's treasure." And Gibbs says, "I searched the island from end to end. No sign of him. Only sand, rocks, and these." And he holds up one of the crabs from the island. And Marty says, "What should we do? Leave him behind and follow the code?" And Gibbs says, "Jack always said the code is more like guidelines, which means we are going against the code to start a search. Get ready to sail. Cut the mooring lines. Hurry." And Marty says, "But where are we going, Gibbs? Where would he be?" And Gibbs says, "To be honest, I don't have the faintest idea." And then we have some more narration that says, "And so, for several days, the Black Pearl sailed all over the sea." Then Gibbs says on the Pearl, "Hurry, before the sea swallows us." And they're sailing between these two islands that are apparently, I guess, pushing together. And then we get some more narration that says, "Moving further away from Crab Island." And then we see Gibbs and the crew come up to some skeletons stuck on trees, and he says, "I think this is the wrong place." And Cotton's parrot then says, "Raise the anchor." And they keep trying to find Jack, and they ask some guy at a port, and he says, "Jack Sparrow? I've never heard of him. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about." But the search was all in vain, as the narration says, as Gibbs and the crew then interrogate some random guy who says, "You found me. You see, I am Jack Sparrow." But then we go later to Gibbs and the crew inside a tavern, and they're listening to this guy who apparently has seen Jack Sparrow. And he says, "I know where he is." And Gibbs says, "Speak, and don't you dare lie." And the guy says, "It's a long story, filled with many sea monsters, as dark as the depths of the sea. It all started when Jack tried to reclaim the pearl." And then we go to a flashback, and we see Davy Jones in this flashback, and Davy Jones yells out, "Sparrow, your luck has run out." And Jack says, "Already? Can't we negotiate this?" And then Gibbs says, "Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman." And the pirate says, "I'm not finished yet. Listen, the situation was becoming dire. But when death seemed certain, the captain managed to escape." In this whole flashback, Jack is sinking in the water, fighting off Davy Jones' crew, but he is essentially saved by a shark that he rides on to get away from Davy Jones. And Jack says, "Ah, thank you, darling." And back in the present, the pirate telling the story then says, "And now he returns to his ship." And Marty says, "What? In the shark's mouth?" And another pirate comes in and says, "Nonsense! Only I know where Jack Sparrow is, because I saw him. I was there myself." And then we get to another flashback with Jack, Barbossa, Villanueva, Cheval, and this pirate who is telling the story. And Jack says, "Hidden caves on islands. When it comes to hiding things, pirates lack imagination." And Villanueva says, "Quiet, Sparrow. My grandfather hid 100 golden cannons here." And Cheval says, "Which he stole from my ancestor." And Jack says, "Quiet, mate, or you'll miss a beautiful sight." And they come up on a ship in this cavern with all of those gold cannons Villanueva was talking about. And then Barbossa says, "I'm afraid you'll be missing out on that sight, Jack." And Jack says, "Well, Barbossa, that's what I expected from you. By the way, the Spaniard hid the cannon's secret from you, too." And Cheval says, "What secret, traitor?" And Villanueva pulls out his sword and says, "I will not tolerate such insults." And Cheval says, "Then get ready to pay." And the two of them begin to fight, and Barbossa just sighs and puts a hand on his forehead as Jack gets the secret from these cannons. And the guy telling the story says, "So having taken the diamonds hidden in the cannons, Jack Sparrow slipped away and was caught in the middle of a war." And of course, he's caught in the middle of a ship battle between Villanueva and Cheval. And Villanueva says, "I'll sink you, penniless Frenchman." And Cheval says, "Just try, Villanueva, you devil." And then back in the present, Marty says, "That seems unbelievable." And Gibbs says, "Still, there may be some truth to it." And then we get a whole bunch of random pirates telling stories that they think are true about Jack. And one of them says, "It's an illusion. Jack is on the white pearl, a glittering reflection of the black pearl." And then we see a lady pirate says, "No, Jack joined the Navy. And then another pirate says, Jack is at the bottom of the sea. And then a whole bar brawl begins to break out in the tavern. But suddenly, another pirate walks in, shoots his pistol, and quiets everyone down. And he says, enough! There is only one truth, crew of the Black Pearl. Jack needs you. And then we go into his story, and he says, I bet he was after Suarez's crown, which bestows immortality to the wearer, and he probably found where it was hidden. But he didn't know that to possess immortality, you always have to pay. And while this guy is telling the story, we see Jack digging a hole on Crab Island and falling into a secret temple. And he finds the crown of Suarez down in this temple, but he's ambushed by some potentially cursed guards. But we go back in the present, and this pirate says, he's still there, but you can't reach him. You can only help your captain by showing him the way. And Gibbs says, but how? And the pirate says, by starting a fire deep in the sea around Crab Island. Goodbye, Mr. Gibbs. And Gibbs says, wait. And Marty says, starting a fire in the sea? Is he crazy? And Gibbs says, but he knows about the crown, and he knows my name. We have to trust him. We have to light the way, and I think I know how. And then we go to later that night, and the narration says, and so, in the vast Caribbean Sea, and we see Gibbs and Marty up in the rigging of the Black Pearl. And Gibbs says, once I heard of the Fuegos, sparkling spirits lurking in the sea. There! And Marty says, what are they, monsters? Cursed pirates? And Gibbs then says, fish! And we see these are actually fish that have fire coming out of the top of them once they emerge from the water. And Gibbs says, we need to catch them and release them in the sea around Crab Island. Come on, mates! And then out of nowhere we hear Jack say, hurry up, you mangy dogs! And Gibbs says, did you hear the captain's order? Captain? And Gibbs turns around and he sees Jack Sparrow standing there. And he says, Jack? But how? From where? What about the curse of Suarez? The fire in the sea? And Marty says, I told you it was all a fairy tale. And Jack says, yes, but in fairy tales there are also hidden details. Maybe I did fall into a trap somewhere. And thanks to you, I was saved and discovered immortality. And we see that Jack does have Suarez's crown. But Gibbs says, but we haven't caught the Fuegos yet. Then Jack says, then maybe I boarded a passing ship and won the crown in a dice game. And then the crown turned out to be a map. Who knows? The main thing is, there's always a story to tell about Captain Jack Sparrow. And that is the end of the Return of Jack Sparrow. What I love most about this one is how devoted the crew of the Black Pearl is to finding Jack. Gibbs and Marty especially have some great moments here, and it really just shows how much they do actually care about Jack. But besides that, we get all of these tall tales about Jack's whereabouts from all these different people, and in these stories we see Jack Sparrow battling Davy Jones under the sea. We also see Jack along with Barbossa, Eduardo Villanueva, and Capitan Chaval searching for these golden cannons that were hidden by Villanueva's grandfather. While Jack does show up at the end of the comic, we still really don't know how he got back to the Black Pearl. But the comic as a whole just shows the fact that there are countless stories about Jack Sparrow that may or may not be true. It also adds to the mystique and legend about him, and overall, I really like this comic. As I said earlier, the way the crew cares so much about Jack to sail across the entire Caribbean looking for him is so sweet. I love that so much. But let's move on to The Lost Sea, which appeared in issue 12 of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in April 2008. This comic introduced another new character by the name of Grace Guitard, and the comic revolves around her trying to take revenge on Jack Sparrow for what she believes he did to her father. I know I've said I love every comic so far, but this one is also super, super fun. So let's dive right into it. So once again, the comic begins with some narration that says, Pamlico Island, a British naval base. And we see Marty and Gibbs on the Black Pearl, and Marty says, the captain said, wait for my signal, then raise the sails. What signal was he talking about? And Gibbs says, I don't know, but when the time comes, then suddenly a big explosion happens on the wall of the fort. And obviously that is the signal. And Gibbs says, well, no, hurry, lift the anchor. And then we see Jack rowing back to them in a rowboat. And once Jack gets back on board the Pearl, he says, we have the map, let's go. And Gibbs says, as you command, Captain. And as the Black Pearl sails away, we go inside the fort, into the room that Jack escaped from. And we see a mysterious character who says, "Jack Sparrow, that scoundrel. Do you think, my dear, that you will be able to steal our precious map from him?" And then we see another character. She says, "I will chase him to the ends of the earth and beyond, Lord Maynard. I have a score to settle with him. He sank my father's ship. I will cross swords with him." And Lord Maynard says, "You were a worthy daughter of Captain Guittard, Grace. Recover the map, at any cost." And then we get some more narration that says 8 days later in the Caribbean. And we see Jack trying to follow this map, and Gibbs says, "Captain, we've been sailing in circles for a while now. Are you sure you're following the map correctly?" And Cotton's parrot then squawks out, "Lost!" And Jack says, "Cotton's parrot is not mistaken, Gibbs. We did deviate from our course, deliberately. This is the only way to reach the Lost Island, where the treasure known as the Terror of the World is hidden." And Gibbs says, "But this island is in the middle of the Lost Sea, where not a single ship has ever returned from." And then Jack says, "Not a single one, still. But we're on board the Black Pearl, and we're not in any danger." And then we see they're being pursued by a few ships that begin to fire on the Black Pearl. And Jack says, "Now that's a surprise." And Gibbs says, "And too close. We're surrounded." And then Jack says, "Don't be afraid. Keep heading for the Lost Sea. They won't reach us there." But, of course, the ships do catch up, and Gibbs says, "Captain, they're catching up." And Jack yells, "Hold on, you mangy dogs." And we see Grace and her crew come aboard the Black Pearl. And Grace says, "I've found you, Sparrow. Now you won't escape." And Gibbs says, "Jack, there are too many of them." And Cotton's parrot says, "To arms." And Jack says, "A few more miles and we'll be fine." And then we see Grace puts her sword right at Jack's neck, and she says, "It's over now, pirate." And then we get some narration that says, "Soon after this." And we see Jack, Gibbs, Marty, and Cotton in the brig. And Marty says, "We're in deep trouble this time." And Gibbs says, "Yes, and we're not getting out of this easily." And Jack says, "Feel sorry for yourselves as much as you want, mates. Just look here first." And they look through a hole in the ship's hull, and Jack says, "Interesting, isn't it?" And then we go on board with Grace and one of her crewmen, and he says to her, "Captain, why is it suddenly day? What's going on?" And Grace says, "I don't know. I have no idea where we are. You can't make out anything on this map. This must be a curse. I've never seen anything like it." And then Jack says to his crew, "This is not a curse, gentlemen. It's clear that we've reached the Lost Sea. Here, everything changes to its opposite. Day becomes night, bow becomes stern, and when we were locked in the brig, they actually unlocked the door." So the door is unlocked, and Jack and the crew make their way out, and Gibbs says, "But it's impossible." And Jack says, "Exactly, Mr. Gibbs, but here even the impossible becomes possible. So, are you ready to fight with your other hand?" And then Jack and his crew then rush up on deck, and they yell, "Let's take back the Pearl, mates." And Grace says, "But how? It doesn't matter. Show them no mercy." And very quickly after, Grace and her crew are thrown overboard, and one of her crewmen says, "Incredible, they're invulnerable." And Grace says, "No, we've become powerless. How?" And then Marty looks out and says, "The ship is free, Captain, and the Lost Island is ahead of us." And Jack says, "Excellent, Marty. Turn the Pearl in the opposite direction and we'll make it there." And Marty says, "I've never heard such a ridiculous order." And Gibbs says, "Neither have I. But everything else here is opposite too, right?" And then we see in the background Grace is swinging on board the Pearl. But soon after, Jack, Gibbs, and Marty are on the Lost Island. And Jack says, "Right. To open the treasure chest, we have to close it, savvy?" But out of nowhere, Grace slams her sword right into the treasure chest, and she says, "Maybe you misunderstood me, Jack, but you are my prisoner." And Jack says, "Is this really the time, miss?" And Grace says, "Grace Guittard, you sank my father's ship, and you will pay." Then Jack says, "I don't want to disappoint you, but you're making more than one mistake. First of all, on this island you won't be able to shoot me even if I stand still. Secondly, I have never sunk any Captain Guittard or his ship. You may want to look around, dearie." And then Grace says, "What are you saying?" And Jack says, "Your father made you believe I sank his ship, so he could become a pirate. The terror of the world belonged to him." And then we see that the Guittard family seal is actually on the chest, and there's a flag with it as well. And Grace says, "No, it can't be. Why would he do that?" And Jack says, "For the only thing all pirates have, freedom." And we see in the background Gibbs and Marty are stealing the treasure chest. And Jack goes with them and he says, he didn't want to obey the laws of the Navy, only the laws of the sea. And you should do the same, Grace. So Jack and his crew then leave Grace on the island, and then a little bit later, the crew yells out, "What? The treasure turned into sand!" And Jack says, "Well, yes. Once we left the lost sea, it ceased being treasure." But Jack continues and says, "Cheer up, mates. Only one thing matters, that the Pearl is still sailing toward the horizon. And there's now one more free person in the world." And then we see Grace with her father's flag on her sword, and she is sailing on the wreckage of the ship. And that is the end of the Lost Sea. And so, as I said earlier, we are introduced to another new character who is named Grace Guittard. She is the daughter of Captain Guittard, and Grace has believed for assumedly years that Jack Sparrow sunk her father's ship. So she has a personal score to settle with Jack, but she finds out at the end of the comic that her father faked his own death so he could become a pirate. And it is implied that Grace will follow in his footsteps at the end here, when Jack says, "There is one more free person in the world." I love getting new characters introduced into the Pirates world, and especially female characters, as there are not as many of them in Pirates of the Caribbean. So it is always super cool to get more of them. Let's also quickly talk about the Lost Sea itself, as this is a place where everything becomes opposite. We see night becomes day, and the brig unlocks itself, since that is the opposite of it being locked, and it even goes so far as to fighting with your non-dominant hand, and apparently to sail a ship backwards to go forwards. It is a really neat concept and adds a lot of humor into this comic too. But next up we have our final Pintel and Ragetti comic, and this is called The Sleeping Island. This appeared in the 13th issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in May 2008. And not only that, as I'm fairly sure this also appeared in the Disney Adventures magazine as well, in the summer 2006 Comic Zone issue. I don't know for sure, but I'm trusting the POTC wiki on that. If you listen to the last episode, in that one we covered the other 3 Pintel and Ragetti comics, those being Jailbreak, Breakout, and Pearly Gaze. While Jailbreak and Breakout revolve around Pintel and Ragetti's unsuccessful and successful attempts to escape prison, Pearly Gaze and the Sleeping Island take place after they escape and while they're searching for the Black Pearl. So that sets this comic before Dead Man's Chest. In this comic, Pintel, Ragetti, and the prison dog find a mysterious island that Pintel believes is where some buried treasure is hidden. So let's go and read this one. So the comic begins with Pintel, Ragetti, and the prison dog in their rowboat. And Pintel says, "We're bound to find the Black Pearl sooner or later." And Ragetti says, "We haven't stopped rowing since we escaped from Fort Charles. Just finding a place to rest would be all right for me." And then they see an island in the distance, and Ragetti says, "Hey, our luck's changing. Look, Pintel." And Pintel says, "What? That's impossible. I know this route like my own pants pockets. There's never been an island here." And Ragetti says, "You must have missed it. Maybe there's holes in your pockets." And then Pintel says, "Hold on, Ragetti. Does this island ring any bells for you?" And Ragetti says, "Well, it is pretty eerie." And Pintel says, "I mean the marking points. I've heard them recited 1,000 times. 10 paces south of the bent palm tree, 30 paces west of the rifle-shaped rock." And Ragetti says, "So what?" And Pintel says, "So, we're about to be rich." And he slaps Ragetti on the back, and his eye pops out, and Ragetti says, "Ah, my eye!" And Pintel goes and grabs a shovel out of the boat, and he says, "This is the island where Captain Bad Barak hid his treasure. This is it. This is where we dig." And he slams the shovel into the ground, but it doesn't make a dent. And Ragetti says, "Weird, you barely put a dent in the ground." And Pintel says, "Let me try again. Only this time, harder." And then as he slams the shovel into the ground again, the whole island begins to rumble. And Pintel says, "Uh-oh, what's going on?" And Ragetti says, "The island is shaking. Let's get back to the boat, fast." So once Pintel, Ragetti, and the prison dog are back in the rowboat, the island then begins to sink into the water. And Pintel says, "Phew, just in time." And Ragetti says, "That was a close one, Pintel. That was no ordinary island. That was the Kraken. Sometimes they float and fall asleep for years. They even grow trees on their backs. They're so big, it's easy to mistake them for islands. And if..." And Pintel interrupts him and says, "Shut it, Ragetti. Sea monsters and krakens are not real. They're just a silly legend, like sea serpents." And Ragetti says, "Like sea serpents, you said?" And then we see a giant sea serpent is now behind Pintel, and he says, "That's right." And of course, he has no idea, and Ragetti says, then we have nothing to fear. And that is the end of The Sleeping Island. This one is very fun, and I love the humor here, especially at the end, where the sea serpent shows up right behind them and Pentel has no clue. But I also like how we get a mention of the Kraken here too, which also builds into their harebrained stories about the Kraken, and harkens back to the moments in Dead Man's Chest where they're trying to decide on the pronunciation of the word. A fun and right-to-the-point comic, and that is the last of the 4 Pentel and Ragetti comics. But that brings us to the last comic we are covering today, which is named A Quiet Life. This appeared in the 14th and final issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in June 2008. And this one is awesome, as it takes place after At World's End. And the main characters in this comic are actually Murtagh and Mulroy, who by this point have just become pirates, as we see at the end of the movie. This comic is super fun and shows Murtagh and Mulroy trying to adjust to their new life as pirates, which is far more chaotic than they originally believed. So let's dive right into this one. So the comic begins, of course, on the Black Pearl, and Murtagh and Mulroy are enjoying the view, and they say, "What a beautiful view." And then we get some narration that says, "On board the Black Pearl, stolen from Jack Sparrow by Barbossa." And then we see Mulroy say, "It's a great idea, Murtagh, to leave the Navy and become pirates." And Murtagh says, "That's right, Mulroy. Now we'll have a different life. No stationed watches, ridiculous orders, or battles with undead pirates." And Mulroy says, "No hearts beating in chests, no more sea monsters, nothing but sailing out of the Caribbean sun and finding treasure." And they're interrupted by Pentel, who says, "Come on, you lousy mutts, get to the rigging, a storm is coming." Then we see Murtagh and Mulroy get to work, and Mulroy says, "They don't have great manners, but it doesn't matter." And Murtagh says, "Especially when you sail on a sea like this. Don't worry, it'll all be fine." And Mulroy says, "Storms are common here, nothing to worry about." And Murtagh says, "I agree, friend. After everything we've experienced, this is the life we were made for. Peaceful, safe." And the narration says, "Their words could not be more wrong." And then we flash forward to the two of them in the middle of a ship battle, and they're swinging between the ships, and we see Barbossa in the background, and he yells, "On board, you bunch of weaklings!" And Mulroy says, "I don't know how to swim." And Murtagh says, "Neither do I." And the narration says, "Everything begins to happen again, time after time." And we see Murtagh and Mulroy potentially digging up buried treasure, and they see a skeleton in the hole. And Mulroy says, "Murtagh, I think it's looking at me." And Murtagh says, "No, it's impossible. Dig, don't get distracted." And then we flash forward to Murtagh and Mulroy, along with Pentel and Ragetti, in a rowboat, escaping from a giant sea monster. And Mulroy says, "Didn't we say there would be no more monsters?" And then we go to the two of them in the middle of a battle. And Mulroy says, "Who are these people?" And Murtagh says, "They're Amon's pirates." And then we see there's another rival pirate crew here, and Mulroy says, "And who are they?" And Murtagh says, "It seems Amon's pirates allied with Jocard's pirates." And then we go to Murtagh and Mulroy on the Black Pearl with Pentel and Ragetti, and we see there's a big whirlpool approaching. And Mulroy says, "Isn't that whirlpool too close?" And Pentel says, yo ho, come on, sing with us." And Ragetti says, "That's an order, mates. Don't think about the whirlpool." And then we get the narration, and finally, everything calmed down. And we see Murtagh and Mulroy are completely exhausted. And Mulroy says, "Actually, it's not such a peaceful life." And Murtagh says, "But we've done pretty good, haven't we?" And then we see Pentel and Ragetti says, "Not bad at all, considering it was your first day." And Pentel says, "Now get some rest. Tomorrow it all starts again." And that is the end of A Quiet Life. I love this one, as it is the only comic that shows Murtagh and Mulroy as pirates. Of course, we did see them in Jailbreak and Breakout, but here we see them trying to ease into what they originally believed to be an easier life as pirates. Obviously, they find out they could not be more wrong, and they experience more undead pirates, sea monsters, wild storms, and battles with rival pirates. And we see at the end that all of this apparently transpired in one single day, which is super funny. And I love Pentel and Ragetti in this comic too, and it's almost like the opposite of the relationship we saw between the two duos in the earlier comics, with Pentel and Ragetti ordering Murtagh and Mulroy around instead. I love getting to see the two of them adapt to the pirate life, and it's a cool stepping stone to where we end up seeing Murtagh and Mulroy in Dead Men Tell No Tales, where by then they have been full-fledged pirates for over a decade. It is really fun seeing them out of their element here, and overall, such a great comic. But with that, we come to the end of this episode and the end of our 3-episode journey through the countless pieces of Swashbucklers content. I have had so much fun talking about these comics and books, and they are all so nostalgic for me, and I'm sure for many of you as well. All the comics I talked about today were comics I didn't know existed until 2023, so while I don't have memories of reading them over and over again when I was a kid, like the ones we covered in the last episode, the Swashbucklers art style will always bring me that feeling of nostalgia no matter what. All the characters are drawn in such fantastic ways, and it gives each of them such a unique look that really makes them so memorable, even though we have real-life versions of the characters in the movies. This part of the Pirates universe means so much to me, and these comics are such a great source of joy. It's hard to describe, but the stories in these comics are much more magical and out of the box than the movies, and I think that's what leads these to being so much fun, no matter what age you read them. They have this sense of childlike wonder to them, with all these fantastical things happening, and magical artifacts being discovered, and they really exemplify why a Pirates of the Caribbean animated series would have been absolutely incredible. All of these comics could have made such fantastic episodes, and if the show ever did happen, if any of the real episodes were anything like these comics, it may have been the best animated show of all time, at least to me. There are so many artists that I'm sure contributed to the Swashbucklers art style and the drawing of all these comics, not to mention the writers and everyone else involved with the process of putting these comics together. I want to give a massive, massive thank you to everyone involved with the creation of these comics, as they really mean so much to me and many Pirates fans. And once again, huge shout out to Captain Bulbul for scanning all of these Pirates of the Caribbean magazines, because if it weren't for them, this episode would literally not exist. Thank you again for your amazing contributions to the Pirates fandom, and once again, thank you to Noble Pirate for also archiving these comics on your DeviantArt. And thank you for listening to this episode. This 3-part series was an incredible way to celebrate 3 years of the podcast, and I could not be more grateful and thankful for all of your support over these 3 years. Also, thank you if you've left a rating or review on whatever platform you listen on, as it really does mean so much to me. Next time we'll be covering something else that also was published during this time period, and that is the Pirates Code/Guidelines book. It is an in-universe book technically written by Josh M. Gibbs and has some really, really cool bits of lore in it. It's going to be a lot of fun, so definitely stay tuned and come back next time for that book. But thank you once again for listening to this episode, and I will see you all next time. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram and Threads at Podcast of the Caribbean, and over on Twitter/X and Bluesky at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content and trivia, so make sure to check those platforms out. And you can also buy merchandise for the podcast over on TeePublic and Dashery. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.